The wind tasted of dust and accusation. It whipped Alara's worn skirt against her legs as she stood on the edge of Oakhaven, the place that had broken her, the place Thomas had walked away from, leaving her name echoing with pity and scorn. 9 months had passed since he'd declared her barren ground, fit only for sorrow, and ridden east without a backward glance. Now she was back, but not alone. Behind her, huddled near the wagon, were 9 children, their faces a mixture of weariness, fear, and quiet trust. Not hers by blood, but hers by circumstance, by shared hunger and the long, hard road that had forged a bond stronger than any born of ease. A ragged assortment, from a boy who looked maybe 10 winters old, protective and watchful, down to a silent toddler clutching a wooden doll. Whispers started before she even reached the first weathered building. Eyes, sharp as broken glass, peered from curtained windows and shaded porches. Mrs. Gable, whose tongue was known to flay hide from bone, emerged first, planting herself in the dusty street like an oak stump. Her gaze swept over the children, then settled on Alara, suspicion curdling her features. "Alara, back, are you?" The word hung heavy, laden with unspoken judgment. "And what in God's name is this?" Alara held herself straight, though her insides trembled like a leaf in that relentless wind. "I require shelter, Mrs. Gable. For myself and these children." Her voice was low, steady, stripped of any plea. Laughter, thin and cruel, rippled from the small gathering that had formed. "Shelter? You couldn't even hold onto a husband, Alara. Couldn't give him an heir." A man's voice called out, laced with mockery. "Now you turn up with a whole pack of strays." The word felt like a stone thrown at the children. The oldest boy, Silas, stepped slightly forward, his young face set in a defiant line. Alara put a hand on his shoulder, a silent reassurance. Mrs. Gable sniffed, adjusting her shawl. "There's no room here for more mouths, especially not these. Oakhaven takes care of its own. And you're not Oakhaven anymore, are you?" Not after Thomas left. Her eyes narrowed, darting towards the children again. "Where'd you get him? Stolen?" The accusation, raw and unfounded, struck harder than the wind. Alara felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. This was worse than she'd expected. She hadn't come for acceptance, only a roof, some safety for the children. But the town, steeped in its small-minded certainties, saw only a woman who had failed by their measure, now compounded by this inexplicable burden she carried. "They are under my care," Alara stated simply, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "They are harmed by no one." "Care?" Mrs. Gable scoffed. "You look half-starved yourself. What care could you offer? Best you move along, Alara. There's nothing for you here." A few more voices chimed in, urging her departure, their fear of the unknown, of something disrupting their stagnant world, palpable. There was no welcome here, only rejection. The dream, fragile as spun glass, of finding some toehold in the world she knew, shattered. Alara looked at the children's wide, anxious eyes, the younger ones starting to whimper softly. Oakhaven would offer no refuge. The raw, untamed land surrounding it was their only option. She turned the wagon slowly, pulling it away from the hostile faces, away from the life she'd once lived and lost. The setting sun cast long, accusing shadows. There was an abandoned miner's shack a few miles out, half-collapsed but offering some minimal shelter from the elements. It was barely more than kindling, but it was outside the town's reach. That was all that mattered now. As they bumped along the rutted track, Alara felt a familiar despair clawing at her, the crushing weight of responsibility and isolation. But then she looked at the children, huddled together, their small bodies trusting her implicitly, and a spark, small but fierce, ignited within her. She would not let them down. Not now. Not ever. The harshness of the land mirrored the harshness of the people. Survival here would demand everything they had. But perhaps, away from the judging eyes, they could find something the town denied them. Peace, and the chance to simply exist. The night descended, vast and indifferent, over the small wagon carrying its improbable cargo towards an uncertain future. The miner's shack was worse up close. One wall sagged precariously, the roof leaked in multiple places, and the single room was thick with dust and the smell of disuse and rodent droppings. But it had 4 walls, or mostly 4, and a fireplace that, with some clearing, might be usable. Elara set about making it habitable, her movements efficient despite her weariness. Silas, the oldest, helped without being asked, his small hands surprisingly strong as he cleared debris. The other children watched, quiet, occasionally asking small, hesitant questions. Providing for them was a monumental task. The food supplies she had managed to gather were dwindling quickly. Hunting was necessary, but she was no marksman, and trapping required knowledge she didn't possess. Gathering edible plants from the sparse landscape was a slow, uncertain process. The nights were cold, the days often blistering hot. The wind never seemed to cease its mournful howl. They lived on the edge of survival, each day a triumph of willpower over the elements and the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. Elara taught the children how to mend clothes with scraps, how to conserve water, how to listen for the sounds of the wild. She told them stories in the evenings, her voice a soft counterpoint to the wind, stories that painted a world kinder and more hopeful than the one they inhabited. She saw the fear in their eyes, the weariness, but also a budding resilience, a shared understanding that they were a unit, dependent on each other. Sometimes, she would walk to the ridge overlooking the town, a distant cluster of lights in the twilight. She saw the ease of their lives, the smoke rising from their chimneys, knowing they ate warm meals while she and the children gnawed on tough, scavenged roots or tiny birds Silas managed to snare. The bitterness was a cold, hard lump in her throat. They had cast her out, deemed her worthless, and here she was, fighting for the lives of 9 innocents while they slept warm and full. It was a cruel irony. She began to notice small, inexplicable things. A rabbit snared near the shack, the trap not one of her own making. A pile of dry firewood left neatly near the door when she knew she hadn't gathered it all. A worn but sturdy blanket draped over the wagon while they slept. At first, she attributed it to chance, or perhaps the kindness of some unseen traveler passing through. But it happened too consistently, felt like someone was watching and helping from a distance. One afternoon, while gathering wood further from the shack, she saw him, a man, tall and lean, emerging from the trees. He moved with a quiet grace, blending into the landscape like a shadow. He carried a rifle easily, but made no move to raise it. His face was weathered, framed by dark, unkempt hair, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. Elias. She'd seen him before, occasionally, years ago, when he'd come into Oakhaven for supplies. A solitary figure, living somewhere out in the vastness, viewed by the townspeople with suspicion, a hermit or worse. He stopped perhaps 50 yards away, simply observing her. Elara froze, a prickle of fear mingled with curiosity. Was he the one leaving the gifts? What did he want? He said nothing, just stood there for a long moment, his gaze assessing. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he nodded, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge her struggle, her presence, without intrusion. He turned and disappeared back into the trees as silently as he had appeared. It was a strange encounter, unsettling but not threatening. He hadn't approached, hadn't spoken, just acknowledged. The next day, there was a freshly killed deer hanging near the shack, expertly gutted. Too large for her to have managed, too generous to be random. Elias. He was helping. But why? He asked for nothing, offered no explanation. His help was quiet, practical, a lifeline offered without fanfare. Elara felt a hesitant gratitude bloom, mixed with apprehension. Trust was a fragile thing in this world. But the children needed to eat. She accepted the help, a silent pact forming between the woman cast out and the man who chose to live outside the world that had rejected them both. The barren ground of her despair was showing the first, tentative signs of resilience, nurtured by hardship and the quiet, unexpected hand of a stranger. The quiet assistance from Elias continued. He wouldn't appear daily, but his presence was felt through the small, crucial provisions left near the shack or along the paths she walked: a bag of flour, a few dried beans, cured meat, a bundle of medicinal herbs. Alara never saw him approach or leave the items. It was as if the land itself was providing, guided by an unseen hand. She found herself watching for him, a strange sense of anticipation replacing her initial wariness. When she did glimpse him, usually from a distance, a silent figure observing, she would nod back, a small gesture of acknowledgement and thanks. There was no need for words. Necessity and shared solitude had forged a different kind of communication between them. The children grew accustomed to his presence too, sensing he was not a threat. Silas even started leaving small, carefully carved wooden figures or smooth, interesting stones near where Elias usually appeared, a child's silent offering of gratitude. Elias never took them, but he would rearrange them slightly, a subtle sign he'd seen them. As the days shortened and the air grew sharper, the landscape took on a brittle beauty. Winter was coming, and with it, a new, more formidable threat. The shack, flimsy as it was, would not withstand a harsh mountain winter. Alara knew they needed better shelter, but her resources were exhausted. The town was still a source of veiled hostility, its inhabitants occasionally riding out to stare or shout insults from a safe distance. Thomas was a ghost here, his absence a judgment on her, amplified by the sheer improbability of her return with 9 children. One evening, as a chill wind howled, rattling the loose boards of the shack, Elias appeared not at a distance, but walking directly towards the door. Alara's heart pounded, but she felt no fear. He stopped a few feet away, his face shadowed by his hat, but she could see the lines of concern etched around his eyes. This was the first time he had approached the shack, the first time he might speak more than a handful of words. "Winter," he stated, his voice low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. "I know," Alara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "The shack, it won't hold." Elias nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the children huddled inside, watching him with wide, curious eyes. "There's a cave, further up, sheltered, good for winter." A cave. It was more than she could have hoped for. Natural shelter, hidden away from the elements and the town's prying eyes. Can you show me?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, another slow nod. "Tomorrow, before dawn." That night, Alara barely slept, a nervous energy buzzing through her. The thought of a secure shelter was a comfort, but the prospect of venturing further into the wilderness with the children, guided by a man she barely knew, was daunting. Yet, she trusted him, a trust built not on promises, but on silent, selfless actions. They set out before sunrise, the air frigid and biting. Elias led the way, moving with quiet purpose. Alara followed with the children, Silas helping the younger ones over rough ground. The trek was difficult, the terrain unforgiving. By midday they reached it, not just a cave, but a deep overhang, high up on a rock face, well protected and surprisingly large. Inside it was dry and shielded from the wind. It was a fortress compared to the shack. As they explored the cave, making plans for gathering more supplies before the snow set in, Alara felt a growing sense of hope. But it was quickly overshadowed by a new danger. From the ridge below, she saw a group of riders approaching, their figures small against the vast landscape but their intent clear. They were from Oakhaven, led by the blacksmith, a burly man known for his meanness, and Mrs. Gable's husband, equally unpleasant. They had likely come to confront her, perhaps to drive her further out, maybe even claim the shack she'd abandoned. They were too close, and she and the children were exposed on the rock face. Alara felt a cold dread spread through her. This was the confrontation she had feared. Elias, sensing her alarm, moved silently to her side. He followed her gaze, his face hardening as he saw the riders. He raised his rifle, not aiming, but holding it ready, a clear signal. He didn't say, "I will protect you," but his stance, his readiness, spoke volumes. It was not just the mountain or the winter they had to face. It was the cruelty of man, following them even here. The quiet peace of the cave was about to be shattered. The riders halted below the ridge, spotting Alara and Elias. Shouts carried up on the wind, harsh and angry. The blacksmith yelled something about trespass, about vagrants and burdens. Mrs. Gable's husband added threats about driving them out with fire if necessary. Their faces, even from this distance, were contorted with malice and fear of the unknown, of difference, of anything that challenged their narrow world. Elias stepped slightly forward, his rifle held loosely but clearly visible. He still hadn't spoken to the townspeople below, his silence more unnerving than any threat. It was a standoff. Alara stood beside him, her fear replaced by a cold resolve. She had faced down the town once. She wouldn't be driven out now, not when she had found shelter for the children. Silas and the older children gathered behind her, their small faces determined. They understood, in their own way, that this man, this stranger, was standing with them. After a tense few minutes, the riders seemed to confer. They looked at Elias, then at the imposing rock face, perhaps realizing the difficulty of reaching them or sensing the quiet, unyielding strength in the figures above. Elias was known to be formidable, a man who lived by his own rules in the unforgiving wilderness. Attacking him, even with numbers, was a risk they seemed unwilling to take. With a final round of curses and empty threats, they turned their horses and rode back towards Oakhaven, their figures shrinking into the landscape. The immediate threat receded, leaving the silence ringing in its wake. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Elias. He lowered his rifle slowly, his expression unreadable. "They won't bother us here," he said, his voice calm. It was a statement of fact, quiet assurance offered without expectation. Over the next weeks, they prepared the cave for winter. Elias, for the first time, stayed with them, not within the cave itself initially, but camped nearby. He taught Alara and Silas how to track, how to set snares more effectively, how to identify plants for food and medicine. He helped them stockpile firewood, showing them how to create a smoke vent in the cave to make a fire inside viable. His movements were economical, his words few, but his presence was a solid, unwavering support. Alara learned more about him through his actions than any conversation could have revealed. He was a man who had found peace in solitude, but who possessed a deep, unspoken kindness. One bitterly cold evening, snow beginning to fall, Elias came into the cave, accepting the warmth of the fire for the first time. He sat near the entrance, watching the children as they played quietly in the flickering light. Alara watched him, a sense of quiet companionship settling over her. The man who had lived in the shadows had stepped, tentatively, into their light. They survived the winter in the cave. It was hard, marked by scarcity and the constant battle against the cold, but they were safe. Elias became an indispensable part of their lives, a silent guardian, a provider, a steady presence. The children came to accept him completely, no longer shy in his presence. Silas would talk to him sometimes, recounting his small triumphs or worries, and Elias would listen patiently, offering simple, wise counsel. Alara and Elias developed a bond that transcended words, shared glances, mutual reliance, a quiet understanding forged in hardship and solitude. He never asked about her past, about Thomas, or about the children's origins. It didn't matter. What mattered was now, and the improbable family they had created in the heart of the wilderness. When spring finally came, painting the landscape with tentative green, they emerged from the cave not as scattered survivors, but as a cohesive unit. Alara stood taller, her eyes clear and steady. The vulnerability that had marked her return to Oakhaven was gone, replaced by the quiet strength of a woman who had faced despair and built something new from its ashes. The town still existed below, a symbol of the world that had rejected her, but its power over her was broken. She had found her own strength, her own family, in the place she had been driven to. The man who had sought an heir and found only disappointment had left her for barren ground. But she had returned, not having borne children herself, but having found and claimed 9 others, nurturing them, protecting them. And in doing so, she had not only created a family, but had also found a partner in the stoic man who had seen her struggle and offered his silent strength. Her life was not the one she had planned, not the one expected of her. It was harder, more demanding, lived outside the boundaries of societal acceptance. But it was also richer, marked by a love fierce in its protectiveness, a resilience forged in fire, and a hope quiet but enduring. She had been deemed barren, but she had brought life back to the desolate land, a testament to the fact that family could be found in the most unexpected places, and strength drawn from the deepest wells of hardship. The future was uncertain, but she faced it not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew she was no longer alone.